Hey, Cypher here. The trial of the Chicago 7 had so much potential. The court transcript is replete with drama and easy to adapt. Yet this movie fails at it. I don't know what went wrong here, but it was a tremendous letdown. I've been trying to focus on good movies, but my patrons voted for this on Patreon. Honestly, I wish I could have just thrown it aside. When a 1987 made-for-TV movie outdoes this well-funded production, you know something is amiss. The true story is very compelling, because the 10 people on the defense team became martyrs for freedom of speech as a result of this trial. And not just the, I want to say slurs on people's platforms nonsense. No, the real kind of free speech, as in the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Nixon administration tried to silence protesters, and they went to prison for it, like patriots. They turned the court into a circus because there was no other way to redress their grievances, showing what proper civil disobedience looks like. This episode is sponsored by viewers like you and Incogni. The way this platform, as in YouTube, makes its money is primarily through AdSense. They've got to collect your data in order to market to you better. But Google is perhaps the most scrupulous with that information. Others are not. Dozens of brokers collect everything they can about you. There isn't much they can't get at. From stuff as simple as your name, address, and background, to much more private info like relatives, personal habits, and social security numbers. All of that, these brokers sell to whoever is willing to pay. Just think of the times you've mentioned an object in conversation, and then it shows up as an ad to buy on social media. Or when you registered for a website and then get bombarded with spam. Well, Incogni can help. When I signed up, within a week, they'd already had my data removed from over 30 brokers and are working on many more. They actively pester brokers to remove your data from their systems, and with their more detailed view, you can see how many are being resistant and which are taking their sweet time. I certainly saw a reduction in spam after using this service. Plus, who knows what other harmful data they managed to get removed. So if you go to incogni.com/cynicalhistorian and use code cynicalhistorian, you'll get 60% off an annual Incogni plan, linked below. Thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this, and on with the show. The 1968 Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. The most contentious issue at stake was the Vietnam War. Incumbent President Lyndon B. Johnson refused to run for a second term over the controversy. After the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, tensions between the anti-war movement and the Democratic forerunner, Hubert Humphrey, were beyond boiling. Numerous protest groups, most prominent of which was the MOB, Yippies, and Students for a Democratic Society, applied for permits to occupy the nearest park to the DNC. But Mayor Daley had expressly forbade having them too close for fear of unrest, so they were denied. The MOB tried to sue for permits, but a judge denied them. That didn't stop them. Thousands of protesters showed up and camped out. They marched all around the city, chanting things like, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" They'd have concerts and speeches. Numerous undercover officers spied on the proceedings. Daley ordered police to push the protesters out wherever they could, causing serious confrontations with hundreds of injuries. The footage of police savagely beating unarmed protesters nearby the DNC was seriously harmful to the image of the party. With so much chaos, not just in terms of what happened in Chicago, but the entire election season, Republican Richard Nixon won, despite William Wallace taking much of the Southern vote he'd been angling for. Before Nixon could take office, the Department of Justice investigated the Chicago riot and found that the police were at fault for the violence and the attacks upon them were largely defensive. Nonetheless, Nixon's mandate was specifically for law and order, so instead of continuing investigations into police, after a few were acquitted, the DOJ changed to building a case against 8 protesters. They indicted Tom Hayden, John Froines, and Rennie Davis of the SDS, David Dellinger of the MOB, Yippies Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, a social worker named Lee Weiner, and finally Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers. All of them had different charges surrounding a conspiracy to cross state lines and cause a riot. Seale was already under indictment for a cop killing in Connecticut, which he'd later be acquitted of. 2 lawyers, William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass, arrived to represent 7 of the defendants. Judge Julius Hoffman presided over the trial, and the prosecutors were Richard Schultz and Tom Foran. The judge would show much favoritism to the prosecution and rule against most of the defense's motions. The trial was obviously a circus from the get-go. For instance, Seale had only been in Chicago for all of 4 hours, and then the court refused to let him represent himself because his chosen lawyer was sick. Seale had a number of outbursts demanding his right to representation. Not only did Judge Hoffman demand Seale accept Kunstler as his lawyer, despite having refused him, but then had Seale bound and gagged while the jury was present. Hoffman held Seale in contempt, sentencing him to 4 years in prison and declaring a mistrial for Seale only, separating him from the Chicago 7. Hoffman further refused to allow cross-examination of Mayor Daley as a hostile witness, despite his obvious hostility. Then when the defense called for former Attorney General Ramsey Clark to testify that the DOJ had already found Chicago PD at fault, Hoffman heard the testimony without the jury present and then ruled that it was immaterial to the case. The judge had numerous spats with the defense over laughing and snide remarks, while refusing to admonish the prosecution for doing the same. Most embarrassingly, Hoffman started requiring defense to ask permission to use the toilet, and at one point required them to use the connected jail cell rather than the facilities for free men. Yet the defense also caused the circus atmosphere. Abbie was particularly irrepressible, though every defendant cracked jokes and threw invectives. The 2 Yippies once showed up in court with judicial robes on and fake Chicago PD uniforms underneath. But the prosecution regularly threw their own invectives, including denunciations of opposing counsel that would have caused a mistrial under a more competent judge. Nonetheless, Judge Hoffman held all of the defense in contempt at the end of the trial, while the jury was still deliberating, including the attorneys, sentencing them all to prison, most for multiple years. The jury initially was hung, but Judge Hoffman demanded they deliberate longer. They returned with convictions for 5 of the 7, and none of which was for conspiracy. Hoffman heard final remarks and sentenced everyone to the maximum allowed without bail upon appeal. None of the 8 would serve the entirety of their sentences. Sure enough, the nation had watched this fiasco, and many vociferously detested it, mounting a powerful appeal. They were all martyrs for free speech as a result of this. Almost all the convictions were either overturned or declared retrials, and the government refused to continue that prosecution. Everyone was free within 3 years, proving how this was not only an injustice, but an attempt to inspire fear in all countercultural activists. Judge Hoffman was effectively disgraced, but he'd continue to practice until removal many years later. The Chicago 7 or 8 are an example of how political trials can backfire, even when they obtain convictions. Interestingly enough, most of the published works on the trial are simply compilations of primary sources or memoirs. The way everyone spoke during the proceedings makes it inherently entertaining and inspirational. For instance, there's a really nice dramatization of direct court testimony on Audible that was arranged in conjunction with this movie. They used a bunch of voice actors who did a really good job. Plus there's been a bunch of visual dramatizations, some much more fun than this movie itself. For instance, I highly recommend the 1987 HBO special. It's great, composed entirely of quotes and interjections of the actual participants, and clips from 1968, though it omitted the part about removing Clark's testimony. Even before the appeals were complete, the events were heavily fictionalized into a fake chase film called Punishment Park. Abbie Hoffman wrote a fabulously popular account of this and his other experience in the counterculture, but we cannot know the full readership because it's titled Steal This Book. Suffice it to say, there's plenty of material on this case. It should be easy to adapt. Sure, you need to compress time and choose which court fights to depict. I chose to avoid specifics in the reality section because many have done it well before. Aaron Sorkin, a preeminent procedural writer, should have been able to make this good. He also directed this time. I expected a lot better than what we got, but it isn't all bad. Abbie Hoffman was obviously quite the character, and they nailed him really well. The smarmy wit and countercultural antagonism shows up immediately. When they walk in, and the two Hoffmans have a little face-off over their names, it's great.
I didn't want there to be confusion on the matter.
Man, I don't think there's much chance they're gonna mix us up.
We also see Abbie's charm as he has these little stand-up routines throughout the film, where he recounts the trial, and these are composed of quotes from Steal This Book. So that's really well composed and just generally entertaining. We see the whole judge robes fiasco, and it's great fun. And man, when Abbie gets on the stand, it's the best part of the movie.
Give me a moment, would you, friend? I've never been on trial for my thoughts before.
Some of it is mixed with his final statement from weeks later, but it works. Sure enough, there's a ton of quotes throughout this. It's actually quite easy to do on this topic, but the way Sorkin interlaces that stuff with flashbacks to the riot in 1968 works great. They mix it with actual footage sometimes, so yeah. I've seen some fact-checkers complain that they don't show the violence protesters perpetrated, but they do show some, and what the protesters did in reality pales in comparison to the violence police performed. Pretending both sides should be depicted as equal is truly bad criticism. False equivalency is a rampant fallacy that dishonestly tries to silence protest, which is exactly what this trial symbolizes. And for the most part, we see how brutal Judge Hoffman's gag order was on Bobby Seale.
I tried, fairly and impartially. I tried to get the defendant to sit on his own.
It was one of the few points in the trial when you could see the prosecution siding with the defense against the judge. They even get a bit of interpretation in. For instance, there's this give-back theory.
You're a give-back. They give the jury a couple of guys they can acquit, and so they feel better about finding the rest of us guilty.
And then there's this explanation for a rather incendiary speech and what it was meant to say.
If blood is gonna flow, let it flow all over the city. What was that, an order to start a peaceful demonstration?
Our blood. If our blood is gonna flow. City, you didn't mean the cops. You were saying if they're gonna beat us up, then everyone should see it.
It fits what everyone else already said, and it's at least an engaging way to do it. So this isn't a terrible movie, but it could have been a heck of a lot better, as y'all will see. A lot of these are kinda inevitable. Time compression is necessary and often inconsequential. So let me just name off a few inaccuracies that aren't important, but are worth pointing out. Starting off, there's this montage that implies that both MLK's and Bobby Kennedy's assassinations were caused by their anti-war statements. That's overly simplistic and rather poorly put together, especially since King spoke out against the war in 1965, 4 years before his assassination.
Even Rennie and Dellinger, but for the life of me, I can't figure out what the two of us are doing here.
I feel exactly the same way, but
Weiner and Froines wouldn't have been surprised on the court day since they were already indicted and discovery had already happened. Another oddity that I'm guessing is just necessary is how the judge instantly cites defense for each contempt charge.
Are you familiar with contempt of court?
It's practically a religion for me, sir.
Charge Mr. Seale with 1 count of contempt of court.
Bailiff, charge Mr. Rubin and Mr. Hoffman with 1 count of contempt. Charge Mr. Kunstler with 1 count of contempt. Cite Mr. Kunstler with his 2nd count of contempt. Cite Mr. Kunstler with his 3rd count of contempt.
When during proceedings he regularly said ominously, "That will be dealt with later," or whatever. but then we don't hear it again after 5 times, when there were actually 161 different counts of contempt. Next, the death threats to jurors were not on ones that were specifically sympathetic. I don't know where they're even getting it, but it's brief and doesn't really matter. Another strange addition is Rubin getting detained while preventing a rape. No one claimed anything of that sort, but whatever. It's strange that they added anything at all, given how much it omits. I'm fine with omission, but not to the point of fabricating nonsense that actually hurts the narrative. And that's the ultimate measure of whether or not inaccuracies matter. Like how they make it seem like Schultz was opposed to the prosecution.
The Rat Brown Law was created by Southern whites in Congress to limit the free speech of black activists. Civil rights activists.
I know why the police don't start riots.
They'll have witnesses who say they started this one.
And you?
He never expressed anything of the sort, and is a strange mischaracterization. Is Sorkin attempting to make him more sympathetic? Well, it didn't work. Another weird one is that they have Abbie and Tom Hayden at odds over philosophy.
Whatever's going on between you and Abbie, would you keep it out of this building?
If you don't win elections, it doesn't matter what's second. And it is astonishing to me that someone still has to explain that to you.
We're not going to jail because of what we did. We're going to jail because of who we are.
I get that this is supposed to show their different approaches, but why make it antagonistic? That's pretty dumb. Another addition that really didn't need to be in there is that they have Jerry Rubin get honeypotted by an FBI informant.
You don't send a woman to ensorcel me. Oh, it means to enchant, only to have her crush my soul.
No, he wasn't seduced, and he certainly didn't complain about it to Schultz outside of court. That makes Rubin look like a fool for no reason whatsoever. Even worse, they have the famous peacenik, Dave Dellinger, punching Marshall in front of his son. No, that did not happen, and is a weird way to tarnish a man's reputation who literally objected to World War II, let alone Vietnam. Dude didn't have a violent bone in his body, even to defend his own nation against fascist attacks. Then there's the misconceptions this movie pushes that simply don't make sense how Sorkin could have made the error. Like, there's this part where they say it seems like the protesters charged the police in the park.
Take the hill! Stop running!
When they yelled "take the hill" in reality, there were no police on it. In fact, the movie accidentally shows a clip disproving the movie. Then there's the speech from Bobby Seale.
It was premeditated murder! Yes, it was! Fred Hampton was assassinated last night!
What the hell? Chairman Fred's assassination came a month later. This makes it seem like Bobby was acting out because he was outraged about his fallen friend, rather than the actual outrage by Judge Hoffman having refused his Sixth Amendment right to legal counsel. Furthermore, it diminishes Fred Hampton to being a mere second fiddle to Seale, rather than a rising star within the Black Panther Party. I did a whole video on that. Finally, there's the ending, which is all kinds of messed up. The defendants come in for sentencing in jail clothing. Why? Plus their attorneys aren't in that clothing, despite having been sentenced to prison for contempt as well. Plus 2 of the defendants weren't found guilty. Then they have only one defendant make a final statement when all did. I get that might be necessary for brevity's sake, but then why didn't they quote one of the actual statements? They were really good and full of drama, an actual perfect ending that this film refused to do. Instead, we get this final scene where they're listing off fatalities from the Vietnam War, as everyone stands in solidarity and the audience goes wild while the judge haplessly barks for silence. This did not happen. There was one morning where a defendant named some Vietnam fatalities, but only made it through a few before the judge came in and halted it. No one stood, and it was just a stunt. The prosecutors didn't show solidarity, and this diminishes the point of the story. It's a cheap ending which denies the meaning of these proceedings. For being one of the greatest writers of procedurals, Sorkin did a very poor job on this one. Here. He really doesn't like it when I start recording. William Kunstler and William Kunstler, and William, God damn it. Abbie was particularly irrepressible. There we go.